Hello, everyone. Welcome. All right. While we wait for everyone to join, I'm going to introduce Cherae. Hello. Am I pronouncing your name right, by the way?
Yes.
All right.
Yep, that's perfect.
Amazing. So Cherae, also known as CL Clark, is a BFA award-winning editor and the Ignite award-winning writer and author of Nebula-nominated novel, The Unbroken, which was our November fiction pick for the year. It's the first book in the Magic of the Lost trilogy. She graduated from Indiana University's Creative Writing MFA and was a 2012 Lambda Literary Fellow. She's been a personal trainer, an English teacher, and editor, and is some combination thereof as she travels the world. When she's not writing or working, she's learning languages, doing P90 something, or reading about war and post-colonial history. Her work has appeared in various SFF venues, including Tour.com, Uncanny, and Beneath Caseless Skies. Welcome, Cherae. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so this is your publishing debut, correct?
Yes. Well, novel debut. I have had
Novel
short
debut.
stories out, but
I mean, well, congratulations. What was
you.
that process like for you? And I know The Faithless as a sequel is coming out, so how is this sequel process differing the second time around?
The process for getting The Unbroken out, I mean, honestly, though it was painful at times, just like any querying author will know, I think it might have been harder to go around during the sequel. Not necessarily in terms of process, obviously, because I didn't have to query the novel again. I knew it was already sold. Like I didn't have that kind of heartache and pressure of submissions and stuff like that. But I still had to write a book, an entire book, and not like a 70 to 80,000 word book, but like a 160,000 word book in a year, and then revise it over the next year. It was supposed to actually be out in a year, but that deadline blew past, and so you guys are getting a 2-year gap. But it was just, and that was also, this is my pandemic book. So it was just really, really hard to write for so many different reasons. What people say about the second book, the sequel blues getting you, I didn't believe it. I should have believed it. It was awful. Yeah, you like nothing anyone says, no matter how they warn you, nothing just really truly prepares you for the pressure of writing a brand new novel, coming after I mean, luckily, like The Unbroken did well, but that also came with its own pitfalls of like, now I feel like I have to live up to it, while at the same time, dealing with all of the negative feedback that I'm getting from readers who feel like they need to tag me in reviews.
Every author I've ever talked to has said the same thing, where it's like, if you don't like my book, don't tag me. Like, obviously.
Yeah, like you are totally fine to not like my book. That's whatever. Maybe you're wrong, but
They're wrong. They're wrong.
No, like, but that's totally allowed. But with the increasing like publicness of internet, I'm gonna see stuff, and it's gonna suck when I see it, no matter what. Because like Twitter algorithms, for example, because I follow a lot of other fantasy authors and get into fantasy talks about other books, not usually mine, except for when I'm talking about my book. The algorithm's like, oh, you like fantasy books and you talk about The Unbroken and you talk about The Faithless. And so then if someone says, oh, The Unbroken by CL Clark, that sucks, Twitter's like, you want to know about The Unbroken, and it'll show me this tweet.
Yeah.
So that was not great. So I urge you all to use caution when discussing author books in public.
Yeah.
But also, most especially, at the very least, don't tag us and make it even easier for us to.
It's just nice. It's proper etiquette to not do so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a review, like not just like that kind of like trolly, like, oh, this book sucks, like, without really going into detail why, because I feel like that's a lot of the majority of what's put out, especially on Twitter and like TikTok where it's short form. But have you ever seen a review in your sequel writing process that made you think or like made you want to affect how you wrote the sequel?
Oh, definitely. Not always in a way that I'm like, oh, that person had some great ideas. Let me incorporate them. It's not usually like that. Occasionally there would be things where I'm like, oh, well, you missed the point entirely. And I can't fix that. Like that's on you. Because an author can only work with whatever the reader's bringing in.
Yeah.
And I think nowadays, especially, many authors, most authors, I would say, especially authors who are on Twitter, we're very, very aware of willful misreadings, as well as just uncritical readings that might not be willfully malicious, but can have a similar effect. And with that awareness, I think, comes this knee-jerk reaction from many of my peers, to try and clarify everything in the text, to say, okay, well, this is what they're going to think, so I need to make sure that they know that this is what's actually happening. And not many, but not all of us have to then, like, some people are just leaving it in, and I think as a matter of safety or as a matter of like what they think they want to do with the text. But as for me, I actually have to go through, after I've done all of that sort of safeguarding myself and safeguarding the work and trying to make sure that it can't possibly be read incorrectly. I actually have to go back and I take it all out,
Yeah.
because I don't want to write a kind of like, this is how you deal with colonialism and these are the bad guys. That's not what I'm writing.
Yeah.
And so I have to then go back and edit back in the ambiguity and the kind of, I don't know, critical thought requiring dilemmas that the characters are going through. And so that, I think, is more, it's not necessarily a good thing, the reaction I get sometimes when I see reviews. And even the good reviews that are like, oh, I want these two to kiss. And I'm like, oh yeah, let's kiss. And then I'm like, wait, now I have to go edit that out because that actually doesn't really make sense there.
Yeah.
It just, like, I want them to make out, but
yeah,
they wouldn't, they can't, or whatever.
And I think that ambiguity that you're speaking to, because of course there's so much historical context that enlightens your reading of the Unbroken. And I really want to get into that and how that informs that kind of ambiguity of both Terrain and Luca. So I'd love to know what your research process for this was like. It seems as though you based Ballader and Khazali or Khazal off France and Morocco, though I may be wrong about that. Can you share more about the historical inspirations behind your world building?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say not just Morocco, but general, like, the North African colonial regions. So that includes Algeria in particular, but also Tunisia, but also like Senegal and some of France's other territories. So that, like, we get Haiti as well, and Vietnam. But part of it wasn't just the French colonial history, even though that's where I started, because that's what I studied in university and undergrad, and then later in grad school. Though I was in a creative writing program, I was still in colonial, post-colonial literature courses and stuff. But while I was studying, I also just became more aware of just like all the colonial projects that were past and ongoing, or past and ongoing, and just the consequences. So I was also doing a lot of research into like the Native American and Aboriginal Australian kinds of, like, kidnapping is the best word, but just like the taking of children and re-educating them to make them properly civilized.
Like the rehabilitation of
exactly
children. Yeah.
Exactly. So like those kinds of histories, as well as the military histories of like conscripts. So the North African conscripts that fought for France in the World Wars, Black American soldiers fighting in the World Wars and how they were treated when they returned home.
Mhm.
Um, so all of those things influence the life and the world building of the Unbroken.
Yeah. And another like overarching plot line specific to Balladeer is their banning of religion, and
Mhm.
that being a part of how they suppress the Khazali people. And historically, much of colonialism, of course, and colonial power is linked to religion, specifically Christianity,
Mhm.
and using Christianity as a tool to civilize people.
Mhm.
So besides contributing to the story and the magic of the Unbroken, why was banning religion a choice that you made, even though it's really tied to colonialism?
Mhm. Partly because I knew that it was tied to the colonial project. I was like, okay, well, let's see how this can work a little differently.
Mhm.
So there is still the forced cultural erasure, which is a very common aspect of colonial projects, is to say, okay, well, this is your culture, you can't do that anymore. So I wanted to do that still, but at the same time, I wanted to just, I didn't want to write a complete historical analog. This happened, so this happened in history, and so this happens in my book. So I wanted to switch things up a little bit. But there also is, I think, there is a parallel in the hyper secularization now that like in modern days, that you can see that is often equated with um like higher intelligence, or something like spirituality is seen as like a sort of tribal um like inferiority type thing. And so I wanted to reflect some of that, examine some of that, and also completely unrelated to like the actual real world. I at the when I first wrote the Unbroken, like some of the earlier drafts, there wasn't really much magic at all.
Mm.
And then I was like, oh well, we could have some more. Um, but I didn't want to like have a big splash of everything. So I was like, oh well, this is the reason why. That is why it's not like just everywhere. Because it's banned. And that was kind of
Yeah.
how the layers
Yeah.
built up.
As a history nerd reading this, I kind of saw it as like my interpretation personally was removing the excuse that a lot of colonizers like used. So Christianity is like, oh, we have to spread this in the word of God, and this is why we're doing all of these horrible things. It's in the name
Mhm.
of Jesus and blah blah blah.
Mhm.
And by removing that, you kind of strip their mask bare, and you see much more of like the reasons why they're doing it, which is money and
Mhm.
power and, you know, racism and all of these different elements as to why they're doing these horrible things, because you don't
Mhm.
have that like mask of Christianity anymore. So I loved that choice. Um, and another choice that I really loved, and that is a trend in a lot of these fantasy, like specifically Sapphic fantasy novels that are coming out and have gotten a lot of, as you spoke to, like a lot of your contemporaries are linked together, like Samantha Shannon, Tasha Suri, Shelley Parker Chan, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with as well. Um, the fantasy worlds that they're building are kind of um, the opposite of like the George R. Martin, where it's like the misogyny is still there, the homophobia is still there.
Mhm.
But yours was very interesting. Like there's, you know, similarities with the racism and the colonial histories, but you have these white women in powerful positions. You have Kantik and Luca, but when they're being addressed formally, they're called sir and not ma'am, which as a reader illustrates that masculinity is still associated with power. And then Luca and Gil talk openly about having same-sex lovers, suggesting that there isn't as much rampant homophobia in this world that you built. So can you talk about these choices that you made and what you mean for these choices to convey?
So honestly, the sort of thing was just because I liked it. But historically, as a title, it has been gender neutral. It's been used for both men and women. And I was like, cool, that's all I need to know. We're gonna keep it. But one of the things I knew when I was writing this, I didn't want to have Cherae and Luca come up against not only their like power differential and their like just like their positions and like their idealistic positions coming up against each other. So I didn't want to have also like their romance has to be a secret because of this, like in terms of homophobia. However, one of the things many people will talk about when they're talking about homophobia is how intrinsically linked it is to misogyny. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that without homophobia, that means there cannot be misogyny. I mean, at least not in the same sense, because there are still men who think, well, I deserve to have power over this position. Like you can see that with like Rogan and Cherae or Bosang and Kantic. Like there's still these power struggles. But I think the biggest difference when those men are going up against those women specifically is that they know that they won't necessarily win in public just because they're men. They may still feel like they have the right to, but that's more of an individual thing and not something that would socially be accepted. Now, Rogan might be able to go up against Cherae because he has the power, not of his maleness, but of the rest of the military backing him, for example, or just Baladarian association. And similarly, Bosang might be able to beat Kantic in terms of like, he's been there longer and has like social standing and money, but she still has an entire military behind her and the Duke's backing. So socially, they'd have to rely on that more than just their maleness.
Yeah. Rogan made me so fucking
Good. Great.
You wrote a really despicable character. So as I previously mentioned, you're like the last person I've interviewed that's considered part of the book talk Sapphic trifecta. So lucky to been able to chat with Tasha and Shelly and Samantha, who are all wonderful humans and part of that new wave of Sapphic fantasy that I spoke to. Creating those worlds where queerness is more widely accepted. So how do you feel about like the Sapphic trifecta and this new trend of feminist fantasy?
Oh, I love it. I love it. And I mean, as for Samantha and Tasha, now that I'm in London, I actually get to actually hang out with them, and so we talk about this stuff a fair amount. Except for I don't talk to Tasha about her book, her Lotus Empire books, because every time, I don't know, it's just I swear it's like that old adage they say, give two writers the same prompt, you'll get two different books.
Yeah.
And this is true, but I can still see some of the similar threads. So I can't read any of her books until my book is done. So I didn't read book one. I didn't read The Jasmine Throne until The Unbroken was out. I didn't read Oleander's Sword until I had turned in The Faithless. And now we're both writing book three, and we were writing together the other day, and we like kind of looked at each other and we're like, well, should we help each other revise these books or no? And I was like, no, we can't talk about it at all. I just want to see what you come up with. So I'm really excited to see what happens in book three of the Jasmine Throne series. But as a reader, I'm just like, I'm stoked. I couldn't ask for anything more than this. This is like literally what I wanted when I was younger, and I thought that I was going to be the only one, the first one. I was like, I have to get this book out there, otherwise nothing will exist. And now that I'm out, like published, I'm just so excited that that's not the case, because I have so much more to read. Like,
Mhm.
I think I said this one time, but there are just so many Sapphic books now that like I can actually choose not to read them and still have plenty to read.
Yes.
Like, I can think, oh, I don't actually like this kind of book, I'm not going to read it, and I still have so many more to choose
Yeah.
from.
We're spoiled for choice.
Yeah, and I love it, and I
I love
think
it too.
we should get more.
Yeah. I mean, I want an endless supply always, which
Yeah.
is every single month for Sapph-Lit, I put together a list of about 10 books, fiction and nonfiction, to vote on. So that's how we choose our monthly books. We vote as a community.
Mhm.
And there are so many that choosing even the 10 has become so difficult for me. And we get constant suggestions. I get emails all the time, and they just keep coming out. It's amazing. So yeah, very, very good problem to have. So back to, the opening bit of the Unbroken, there's
Mhm.
this really harrowing scene at the gallows
Mhm.
where we see Balladeer forcing a stolen child, Terrain, to enact violence on her own people. And later we find out that, spoiler alert for everyone on the call, we find out that the man that she hangs and puts the noose around is her uncle.
Mhm.
So what made you choose to include this scene so early on? And is there anything that kind of symbolized for you in writing it?
It was actually the first scene that I ever thought of.
Oh.
And so I knew it was going to be the beginning of the book from the moment I even had the idea for the story. At the time, though, it was she was part of a firing squad, it was not a hanging. And that's
Mm.
also how I knew that this wasn't going to be like a sword and sorcery kind of fantasy, but that we were going to move up in the technology timeline. Because I was just like, this is it. This is it. I'm going to write a story about a conscripted soldier who has to kill her own people, and then what that does to her. And that was something that I'd gotten from just all the things I was reading about the conscripted colonial people, not just in Morocco and Algeria, but just all over, the way that some sort of oppressor would get someone to enact oppression on their own people. So that happened in plantations in the US, it happened in India. Just, there's always going to be, like, the best way to oppress someone is to get them to do it to themselves. And you do that by elevating someone just a little bit, not even a lot, just a little bit, so that they know that there is someone beneath them, and that person will just completely do your bidding. And so that's when I realized that's what I was writing about.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, and this is completely different, but in America, when you give, like, for example, white woman, when you give a white woman like an ounce of power to enact oppression over a certain set of people,
Mhm.
they in turn become the oppressor.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, every time I do these author interviews, all I want to do is go back and read the book literally immediately and read it with this new lens. But yeah, when the oppressed become the oppressor, like, that sense of like power it's so it's powerful to have the oppressor show these colonized people like, oh, this is possible for you, but you're going to do it in my way, and you're going to do it like within these confines, but it's still going to be, because it's your entire world, it's going to feel monumental to you, even though
Mhm.
it's so small, and you're still just as oppressed in a certain way.
Mhm. And there's so much denial that goes along with it,
Yeah.
though. That'll be more of a book two conversation. So I'll
Yeah. I mean, getting into that kind of like leads perfectly into my next question. So a lot of the internal conflict that Terrain feels is her loyalty to the country that raised her, and then the people that she was stolen from. Um, And this is further complicated by the relationship with her mother, which, by the way, when we found out the jackal was her mother, I screamed. Great. Everyone in Sapph-Lit was like, when they got to that part, they were like, oh my fucking God. So yeah, 10 out of 10 plot twist. But her mother, when she meets Cherae, breaks her ribs, and of course blames her for the death of her brother. But then Cherae feels like she didn't fight for her as a child when Balladeer stole her. So we get some background on how Cherae and the other Sands were raised, or rather brainwashed, when we learn about the Duodist and Tyrist systems, which from French translate to right wing and Taylor. So, and I think the linguistics of your novel, I love languages, and I think the linguistics were super, super interesting, and definitely want to get into that more. But to what extent do you feel like brainwashing is a part of these systems? And why was it important for you to detail these disciplinary systems out? Was there a specific inspiration behind it?
I mean, honestly, I think brainwashing implies something a lot, I don't know, more torturous or something, when in reality, it's just education. I mean, you would find a similar amount of education and reaction in the US. And I mean, here in England, like there's a reason, like people in certain areas vote a certain way, believe a certain way, they're taught to do it. And not necessarily through violence, just through their surroundings, through the people who they interact with, the people who they look up to, what those people think. And so, yes, you could look at it as brainwashing, but also they just grew up in a certain place and they were taught to feel a certain way about themselves and about other people who looked like them, and about their own superiority compared to other people. And certainly, like, age also plays a role in that. So like you can see that there are different opinions throughout the Sands based on, for some of them, how old they were when they were taken, how much they remember about their homes. But even within those, like, obviously I didn't go into like every single Sand character, but there are older ones who would believe, you know what, this is actually a good deal, fine, I'll take this. So I think, yeah, there's I'm saying something, but I think it's really just a continuation of the rest of the colonial project. It's how the US maintains its hegemony. Like now they do it less through like throughout the world. It's not like textbooks, but it's media, it's movies, it's social media, and stuff like that. And within the US, it is textbooks. These are the things that it's okay for you to learn. These are the things we won't let you learn. It's just so much of it is elision, like what they cut out from curriculum, like cutting out art, for example, is such a big part of, these are the things that it's important for you to learn. And somebody will think, yeah, these are the things that are important. This is what my teachers told me is important. This is what was presented to me. I don't need anything else. So it just depends.
Yeah. On page 165, there's like I'm an annotator, and this was like one of my highlighted moments. There's a wonderful quote where Cherae speaks about feeling like what we now kind of know as a half culture kid, someone who doesn't feel like they fully belong to one culture, that they're either that they grew up in or the culture that they are now present in. So for her, it's between, Khazali and Balladeer. But then we also see Sebastian, who I think is such an interesting character, who can also be considered a half culture kid, being like from the completely opposite side of the colonizer who grew up in the colonized state rather than the country, like his ancestors' home country. So what kind of similarities do you see between the two in that sense?
I think that they are very similar. In fact, you could say they are quite the same, except for the status that they're afforded. because Sebastian would be essentially what was historically called a pied noir in French colonial time, which means he, for the most part, was raised in the colony and not back in Ballader. And so that does cause problems for him when he returns.
Okay, sequel preview.
But it's a matter of respect and hierarchy, just like it is for Cherae. It's just that Cherae is very, 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 very low in the pecking order. But I guess I can't say too much more about Bastian and his fate. But basically, yes, he despite his title and stuff, or being the son of a comte, he is already just kind of a bit of an odd duck if he's in like the rest of society, but within the colony, he is a titled or almost titled. He's a titled heir, I guess. So
it's interesting. I'm just now thinking that these two kind of half culture kids are the two people Luca kind of is drawn to romantically and intellectually. And I think one of the reasons that Unbroken like really made a splash in like the book social media community is that it is in part a romance between the colonized and the colonizer. What was important to you to, like, in building this story, what was important to you to remain sensitive about that relationship?
Okay, before I get into that, I just want to add something to the Bastian thing, because that one's going to be a big one. So a slightly smaller note, I think one of the things that was also important about Bastian being already kind of on the margins in terms of Balladeran society is that he has a little bit more freedom to be weird according to society, which means he can look into the religious research that he wants to do, and he's already kind of slightly outcast, and so he can do things that maybe Luca, under the full glare of the Balladeran eye, could not, and so that I think also was important, just the extra interest he can take in these forbidden topics, which, you know, I'll see you guys in book 2. So back to the other question. A lot was important, including, but most importantly, I think, not romanticizing the idea of consent between the two, because as people point out, and this is actually, I think this is probably one of the most polarizing aspects of the Unbroken, some of those comments that I see or would rather not see. A lot of people don't like the book because of the romance, and that's fine. Like, that's cool. But I think part of it is the expectation that it is romantic, and it's not. It just isn't. It can't be, because of who they are and Cherae's interpretation of their positions. She just doesn't have the freedom or the capacity to consent to Luca in this way. Even if she does think, she's kind of cute, like she just like they could bone and she could enjoy it, but I think that she just wouldn't actually be able to separate those feelings of, did I want to do this, or was I coerced, or is it just because she's here, or is it just because there are no other people that I could be with right now? Like, there are too many questions, and she's too aware of like how much of her fate Luca has in her hands. And I think it would be weird to categorize that flatly as a romance, even though there might be like attraction within that. And one of the things that I really wanted to explore with this was like a real enemies to romance, because I like enemies to lovers romance, was because I love that that trope. And when I was originally writing Cherae and Luca, it was because I really liked the bodyguard royal trope. But then I was like, wait, this doesn't quite work. This kind of like unquestioned devotion can't quite work with them because of the story that I am now telling.
Yeah.
And so then I was like, well, if we're taking that enemies to lovers, but also kind of a little bit of frisson of bodyguard royal, like if we're taking that, how can we make this enemies to lovers like actually real? Like what would it take to go from real enemies, not just like, oh, you hate my father, I hate your father, but we're in love, but like we are actively trying to destroy each other's nations. Like
Yeah.
what would it take for that relationship to go to lovers? And so that's part of what I'm exploring. I don't know if it is something that can work. And so I guess the next couple books will be figuring out what's possible and what's not within these constraints. Like
Yeah.
what would be required, I guess. And, you know, they might make some efforts and we might get a little forward and have some backslides, and who knows?
Before I get into my next question, you saying you love enemies to lovers, that's also my favorite trope, and my TikTok algorithm read me to filth recently about that. It was like, is enemies to lovers your favorite trope? Oh, it's just because you want someone to see the worst parts of you and then fall in love with you anyways. And I was like,
Yeah, I've seen that. And it reminded me of a quote. I think the thing that gets me about enemies to lovers, I think I'm trying to remember who the author was. I think maybe Benjamin Alire. It was like it was about family members, I think, in a completely non-speculative kind of realm, but it was about like people fighting, arguing, and how they hated each other so much, but they like it, like because they hated each other so much, nobody in the world was closer to each other than them, because they were so devoted to each other in that way. And that's my favorite kind of like hatred, enemy
because
to
then you're
lovers.
obsessed with them. Like there's a
Exactly,
lot of
exactly.
obsession and like energy that hatred takes.
Yeah, you can't, like, to hate somebody properly, you have to know them so well. And I'm just like, oh yes.
Like give me
That line is just so thin.
exactly. So you go back and forth between Luca and Terrain's point of views through the novel, The Colonized and the Colonizer, and both, of course, are incredibly conflicted emotionally and morally throughout the story. I love a morally gray, very ambiguous character and thought process and getting inside their head. But as a reader, I of course wanted to throttle Luca and Terrain, but like mostly Luca at a lot of her choices. What do you want readers to empathize with her?
I would like them to think about that themselves, honestly.
Okay. I like that answer. Yeah. Because I mean, like you said earlier, you can't dictate what a reader thinks, and to put in the way that you want a reader to convey a story kind of goes against the purpose of reading in a way. To come up with your own conclusions. But yeah, was wondering if you had any points about that, but I'll let it be. And then back to linguistics. What does sky falling mean? Because I think if I took a shot every time someone said sky falling in a single chapter, I'd probably die.
You probably would die. Yep.
I love linguistics. I think the world building with linguistics is so interesting. So what made you choose this to be like the drinking game phrase that you should never play?
So first I'll give you the definition, because you're not the first person to ask. The first person to ask was actually my dad, because he was reading it. And of course, my grandmother was like right next to him, just kind of like la 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 la. And so he's like, hey, so what's the difference between like sky above and sky falling? And I was like, okay, grandma is right there. Basically, like sky above is damn it. And then I had to like hide my mouth and like stage whisper across so that my grandmother couldn't hear. Like, and then sky falling is like, like holy fucking shit or something like that. But the main idea, there were two ideas. One, I grew up and cut my fantasy teeth on the Wheel of Time, which for any Wheel of Time readers, that like you grow up knowing all these different random cursings for the world, and they're also region specific. And so that had a definite mark on my psyche. And so I think having the in-world curses, they were important to me for that reason, as a little homage, but also because Balladeer is non-religious. They don't have hell, they don't have damnation. And so I couldn't just have them saying damn it all the time. Which then led me to, okay, well, what do they use? And what kinds of language would be left over that they don't think about anymore from their old religion? And what might not have been able to be eradicated in the Big Purge? And so they have these curses that are not religious, but more things you'll find out in book 2.
You just made me realize that damn as a swear is religiously linked. It took me 25 years to realize that. I grew up very religious, so this is like another way that I love to connect to fantasy novels and how they deal with religion and linguistics around it. Not religious anymore, hate personally. But yeah, did not put together that damn is about damnation.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I wasn't as strict with some things because of the way society is set up. Like, in both Balladeer and Khazal, there aren't actually bastards, but sometimes I just needed to call a character a bastard, and I just like, it needed to be there. I was like, you know what, just there. But there isn't actually a societal, like, if you can adopt someone in like, so like in Balladeer society, non-monogamy is fine, but if you're a royal or otherwise titled, you do have to like designate an heir. And so, like, for example, if Luca didn't have a kid, then she would have to, like, if she became queen, she would have to like pick, okay, this kid is going to be my heir, I will now raise him and whatever. And so, like, if she did actually have a kid, I haven't actually figured out if she could disown it and then it would become a bastard. I don't know.
Maybe that'll be a book 3 problem.
Maybe that'll be a book 3 problem.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
And then in terms of the naming system, one thing that Veronica and I texted about was you have, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation potentially, so forgive me, Joshua Din Aranen and Aranen Din Joshua. And like the preposition-ish kind of makes it seem like they're from or of each other. I'm not sure if this is a question, but like I really, really loved that so much. I thought it was so endearing. Was this like specific to them as a couple or like Khazali spouses in general?
Khazali spouses in general. At current though, now that I think about it, they're the only married couple, which I guess I could add another married couple in there somewhere just to make that a little bit clearer, because but no, I just wanted them to be married. And I like we've got Mrs. Man's last name, and so I wanted that idea of possession, but I wanted it to be mutual.
Okay, last question of mine, and then we're going to go into the rapid fire round. And anyone who's on the call, if you have any questions for Cherae, put them in the chat and we can ask them at the end. So the Faithless, it's coming out. Is there anything that you can share with us about what's to come?
Be more specific and maybe I can drop a little hint.
Okay. Will Luca and Tareen kiss more?
Do you really want to know?
Yes. Just a little bit?
I mean, I can say yes. I can say yes. I cannot say that it will lead to the results one might hope for.
That's fine. That's
Okay.
totally fine. And they go back to Balladeer, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily tell you guys, except it's already on the back cover copy. So
that's very true. Yeah. No, I got the bookshop.org description. Like I know some things, but okay.
Yeah. So there will
like
be a little visit.
Yeah.
You'll get to, one of the things I'm excited about is kind of, though the environment changes, you do still get to see Cherae grappling with her ideas of power and both Cherae and Luca as they try and figure out the things that they wanted before. Do they still want them? What happens if you get them? Do you like the person you become when you get them? I think that's going to be the theme for the rest of the series, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And then side note, the cover of Luca just like man spreading on this giant throne, hot, sexy, stunning, love. And I also love how like the two covers together, I'm just now realizing this, you have Cherae really in like an active position of like breaking open this archway kind of. And then Luca's kind of more just like slouched and like resigned, but like the power in both of them, hot. That's all I have to say. That wasn't a question. But okay, rapid fire round. Short questions, short answers, whatever comes to mind. What are you currently reading?
I'm reading, I don't have it in here. I'm reading God Killer by Hannah Kaner. Really, really good. It comes out in January, and I think I'll actually be on a panel with her about like fighting women. So it'll be really fun. But basically, one of her main characters is this God Killer mercenary, who she's a badass, and just it sinks me kind of back into the like old school fantasy, but with like new school mentality. And so I'm really loving it. Highly recommend.
I have not heard of it. I'm adding it to my list. What is a book that you recommend everyone to read?
The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin.
Love. Is there a book coming out soon that you're excited to read?
Like most people probably on this chat, Day of Fallen Night is it's on my list. I have a copy, so I'm going to be getting to that after I finish God Killer.
So jealous. I have mine pre-ordered. I cannot wait to just sit down with that murder weapon brick of a book. We love Samantha in this house. If you could have dinner with anyone dead or alive, who would it be?
Octavia Butler.
Love. Favorite class that you took at university?
Francophone African Lit.
Ooh. Do you have a favorite Sapphic movie or TV show?
At the moment, probably Arcane.
Oh, I've never seen. Okay. I'm adding. This is how I get so many of my like book and to watch lists. Yeah.
Go do that.
I will. That's my homework tonight. Favorite Sapphic celebrity or like person to follow on social media?
I don't know, man. They always tend to disappoint you after a little while.
You're not wrong.
Who do I follow even? I don't know. Pass.
Okay. Did you take up an unusual quarantine activity?
I started video gaming a lot more. I did buy my first little practice sword. So that was
my next question. Tell me about the sword.
This is not the first one I got. This one I got out of quarantine. So this is my long sword as I like skewer my other computer.
Oh my God. Insane.
We love him. And then my side sword is on the floor here. This one is more of a Sabine style sword, which you will learn more about in The Faithless.
Love. That was the end of my rapid fire round. I don't know if we have any chat questions. Everyone on the call, how we feeling? Drop them in the chat if you want anything. But while we wait, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to say to the Sapph-Lit community or want to talk about?
Let's go back to the droitists and the tailleristes, because I actually I came up with them because a mentor who was helping me go through my like final draft before I was going to throw it away, because it was, you know, querying is hard and shit. They were like, you know, you should be like Seth Dickinson, who another one of my favorite books, The Traitor Barbara Cormorant, everyone should read. Like he loves to name everything, like that's what he does. And so I was like, okay, yeah, we need to give names to these things so that they feel real and they offer like this fear and knowledge and stuff. And so the droitists are reflective of the two different schools. No, I'm sure there are more. Two different schools of educating any foreigner, but especially the Sands. And so the droit as like very strict, rigid, is and the right way, and that is like, or like the correct way. And so that's one very like harsh method. And then there's more of the like gardening type, pruning type, the tailleristes. So they just sort of cut and sew, and they're a little bit more gentle, and but still, as you discover, not necessarily pleasant either. They're just maybe a nicer face for something that is just as brutal. But yeah, that was fun to write.
Yeah, that whole debate that they were having about it at the table was so unsettling, because you're talking about these people like you're training dogs. It's so dehumanizing and upsetting.
Yeah, and these conversations are absolutely still happening in like every court across the US. So
yeah, 100%. Yeah, Kantic, another one who like really great death. Very
I love
great
Kantic.
comeuppance.
Oh, sometimes I wish she was still alive.
I mean, another morally gray, like kind of badass person in position of power that could have done a lot of good, but like fucked it. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I don't think we have any questions, but Cherae, thank you so much for chatting with me. This was such a pleasure, and I am so excited for The Faithless. We will definitely be reading it as a bonus book, which we typically do in Sapph-Lit as like our fantasy sequels. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is just like a sort of obligatory plug, but more just because if you guys are going to do it anyway, like no pressure, but if you are going to pre-order The Faithless, I have a link where you can get your email added to the list of people who will get the super sexy digital art that I had commissioned of a certain scene in The Faithless. So I can
Does it
email
include
that.
Two people that might be kissing in the next book?
Kissing is strong, but yes, it does include two people who are in a compromising position. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we will distribute that link absolutely in Sapph-Lit. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and yeah, keep in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you guys
Bye,
so much.
everyone.